Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as we do each week, we take our news stories from our newsletter that comes out Mondays called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And SMIE, in case you're wondering, stands for Social Media and International Education. That's the name of the consulting company that I started 10 years ago. And that newsletter comes out in two forms, either in an email form that you can get in your inbox Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, or via LinkedIn, where you can get in your Monday at about 8:30 a.m. Notifications Eastern Time. So if that's the way you prefer, you have your two options to receive the newsletter. I'm dropping in the link to the website where you can subscribe, a version of the email version of the newsletter from this past Monday, as well as this past Monday's LinkedIn version. So as I shared in the last couple of weeks, we're really excited about the growth of the newsletter subscription base. We're now up to well over 1,950 subscribers in international education that have made this newsletter a part of their international edification each week. So thank you so much for taking the time to subscribe, and please do so if you haven't already. What we're going to do with those news stories we get in the newsletter on Monday is we look at the themes we see developing around certain topics. And then we go a little bit more next level into those topics here on Wednesday in our midweek roundup. So they get the hot takes on Monday, and then after we have a time to really digest them and think about what the implications might be for what we do in international education here in the U.S. and abroad, we go a little bit next level and see what the applications are of these news stories and how that might impact what we do. So let's get right into our first question. For the midweek roundup this week, our first question is one that kind of caught everybody off guard late last week. And that is, did Donald Trump just say that? Everybody was freaking out when they heard this news late last week in terms of whether this report came out from, I read it on, I think, a Friday morning, that Donald Trump had been on a podcast called the All In Podcast. That's typically for venture capitalists, for startups, for the tech industry. That was on Thursday, I think the interview was, and then the news stories started popping out on Friday morning last week. And in this interview, this podcast interview with these other tech firms and folks in the startup business that are really connected to the business world and the tech industry, and obviously Silicon Valley and California, all of that. They asked some interesting questions, and with in an interview with former President Trump. And in that interview, he basically said on day one of his presidency, if he were elected in November, starting January 1, if you remember what happened at his inauguration in 2017, January 2017, we got the Muslim travel bans, which impacted 7 countries, not all of them Muslim, but that's what the implication was, and that led to just the beginning of a very terrible 4 years when it comes to diplomatic relations and international student interest, certainly from the Muslim world and beyond, as seeing the U.S. as a much more restrictive environment and an unwelcoming environment for international students. So in this podcast, and here's what he said, quote unquote, "What I want to do and what I will do is, you graduate from a college, I think you should get automatically, as part of your diploma, a green card to be able to stay in this country. And that includes junior colleges too. Anybody graduates from a college, you go in there for 2 years or 4 years. If you graduate or you get a doctorate degree from a college, you should be able to stay in this country. I know of stories where people graduated from a college and they desperately wanted to stay here. They had a plan for a company or a concept and they can't because of the regulations, right? And they go back to India, they go back to China. They do the same basic company in those places and they become multi-billionaires, employing thousands and thousands of people, and it could have been done here. And a bigger example is that you need a pool of people to work for your companies. You have great companies and they have to be smart people. You have to be able to recruit these people and keep these people. Somebody graduates to the top of the class, they can't even make a deal with a company because they don't think they're going to be able to stay in the country. That is going to end on day one. Okay, that's his quote from the All In podcast. Now, keeping in mind the audience, he's talking to the Tech World podcast. All In's got a really good reputation. They interview all the top players in the industries, but having him on was a real coup. But remember the audience. He's talking to tech companies who are really invested in being able to recruit the top talent from U.S. colleges and universities and also from abroad. So this obviously is talking about international students and whether he realizes it or not, dreamers and those that do graduate from college who do not have already green permanent residency or citizenship. So this implication impacts directly on, if true and if implemented, a lot of ifs in the process here, if it's even legally possible for him to do that on day one, to automatically grant citizenship, or not citizenship, green card status to students once they've graduated from college. Huge implications, goes far beyond anything that the Biden administration had proposed. When Biden took office in January 21, there was in his first Immigration Act that was bogged down in all sorts of other details, and in these omnibus bills, nothing ever gets passed anymore. But there was a proposal in there to grant a PhD graduates in STEM fields green cards when they get their doctorate degree. This is a much broader range, far broader range of implications in terms of what that would mean for graduates from international students from any college, 2-year, 4-year master's doctoral program. This is huge if it ever happens. Now, most of my friends in the international ed world are skeptics whenever they hear Donald Trump say anything positive related to international education. And this certainly, on face value, is earth-shattering news compared to what we have known about Donald Trump and his immigration stance. I think where my colleagues have a hard time drawing lines between for Donald Trump in terms of his very anti-immigrant stance when it comes to the southern border and illegal immigration, and the border that's just basically been open for the last 4 years, and millions have streamed in. Terrorists have streamed in that are on the watch list. There are a lot of gotaways and all these other things that are where there are no rules basically anymore. That Border Patrol agents that should be on the front lines are busy processing paperwork rather than being on the front lines patrolling the border. So all of these things have really received the focus of former President Trump's ire when it comes to immigration, and certainly those are the things he wants to correct. And he's talking in this podcast to tech companies who are dependent on this foreign talent for a lot of positions and who have very hard time dealing with the H-1B process and the lottery system there. So there are real roadblocks to continued volume of hirings for these tech companies that want to give these students a chance. They just can't get them all in because of the lottery system and the caps that are in place for H-1Bs, which are even a preliminary step to getting a green card. So this kind of would circumvent the whole green card process and the even need for OPT. If you get a green card when you graduate, how the mechanics are all details that have not been worked out yet. Whether it's even possible to do that on day one. Typically, when it's proposed, things like this that change immigration status have to be changed in a regulatory way through Congress in terms of adding new visa categories, in terms of creating new processes, or what that actually does is once a student's in the country as an F1 student, do they no longer, and they can have at the end of that rainbow when they get their degree a green card, which is an immigrant status thing. Whether they choose to take advantage of it or not really means does that also have to adjust their initial initial student visa status from non-immigrant to this kind of dual intent category, which again is we've talked about before, will be a huge and entirely different game changer as well on the front end of the process in terms of the vetting that students would have to go through and not have to pass the 214B requirement. That is the biggest obvious deterrent why students get denied visas, or the excuse that students get denied visas is because they are not showing that they have non-immigrant intent. But if this pathway is open, then that by default would seem to mean that the F1 status would also have to be dual intent. So that's a lot of other details that need to be sorted out. We're not there yet. But what this statement has done, it certainly, as what they call in the UK, thrown the cat amongst the pigeons. That everybody is just going, oh my goodness, this is if this happens, what does this mean? And this is can be potentially life-changing for thousands of students who want to stay but can't right now because of the complexities of our post-study work process and H-1B process before they even get to green card status. So you're cutting out potentially 1 to 7 years of time between graduating from college and getting a green card after a minimum time of being on OPT is a year for a company to make a decision to hire you for an H-1B, which is up to maximum of 6 years. Usually during those 6 years is when you decide as an individual on a H-1B whether you want to stay more permanently and apply for permanent residency. And then you're in that permanent residency gap where you've applied, and that could take 6 years or so, who knows, or longer to process. So this is a huge leap forward and eliminating a huge amount of legal hurdles and frustrations and challenges that international students who do want to potentially stay, work, and potentially become residents, permanent residents someday. So if this happens, international education in the United States would be changed forever. Will it happen? There's a lot of folks in Donald Trump's camp who probably are much more reluctant to move forward because of with this kind of a proposal, because they think it's all immigrants are bad, and there's a certain section of the MAGA group, not all of them, a certain section of the MAGA crowd that are very much anti anything foreign. So this is a very different conversation now if this gets inserted into what is on his political agenda. And is what he said in this podcast a fob to the tech industry and saying, I'm there for you? Or is this something that is a real change of heart for him? Who knows? Most of my friends, as I said, in the international community are skeptical. But he did really say this. Whether he actually means it and whether it's actually implementable day one, there may not. I don't think it would be day one, because that's something I don't think presidents have the ability to grant by fiat, presidential fiat, that kind of sea change in immigration regulations from the executive branch. So we'll see what happens, but certainly has made the conversation very interesting. And what is this plan involved? Obviously, international students don't vote in the United States, but they vote with where they put their applications in, don't they? And the question of, does this really matter? Did he really say that? Is yes, he did. Did he really mean it? Is it really implementable? Those are questions that we'll certainly cover in the weeks and months to come. We'll actually go into that with our second question. But you see what in certain markets around the world, any kind of talk about changes to immigration regulations or work permissions and green card status, lotteries, all of those things are intensely focused upon in certain key markets. And we all know which one we're talking about more than any other, and that's India. So, but does it impact dynamics in other countries that might have said, well, I'd love to be able to stay in the United States and work and then maybe become a permanent resident, but that process is so onerous, I don't know if I want to go through that. For some people, it's their American dream, and they're going to pursue it with all their heart, mind, and soul, with every resource that they have. Others, it's too complicated. It's easier if I go to Canada. Maybe not anymore. It may be easier if I go to Australia. Maybe not anymore there either. In the UK, maybe not anymore. Maybe I have to look in Europe now. But this would be a huge game changer if big if, huge if, I'll put that caveat in there, huge if it ever does happen. But he did just say that. And I know a lot of colleagues are very skeptical about this. And there's anyone in the business who knows former President Trump would be a little bit reticent about that, about anything he says, but until they see action. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. And if he does on day one say that's something he wants to do and puts into place some executive orders to explore or do whatever steps he needs to take, whether that actually will happen or not, whether that gets walked back during the process of the campaign, all of these things are still up in the air. But he did say it. Now, that's question number one, a very meaty question and one that we could take the whole half hour on here on the Midweek Roundup. And I'm sure there'll be many more conversations like this in the weeks and months to come leading up to the election and certainly afterwards if he is reelected or is elected to a second term. So let's move on to our second question, also touching on elections. Will the U.S. election really make a difference for international students? Now, in terms of who's in power, policies that they might have, views of Trump now versus Biden versus Trump 4 years ago or 8 years ago, 4 years ago, really. Those are the things that we're going to look at in this second question. And we're starting with certainly something that we've seen a couple different ways talked about. And what we're certainly going to see this in next week's newsletter and what Trump said and the global response to that. And I mentioned India and a couple other places that all the articles you're going to see certainly reflect surprise, to say the least, with President Trump's former President Trump's statement regarding giving green cards to all foreign college graduates who graduate from U.S. colleges or universities. So we'll talk more about that in the weeks to come. But there's regarding the election itself. One of the organizations that's done some research in this area is our friends at INTED. They did Know Your Neighborhood series over the years, and back in 2020 they did another version of this regarding the elections, and what they have had to say on this is we're looking actually at 2016 data on if Trump were elected, would that make you more or less likely to study in the United States? Back then there were 50,000 plus students that took this survey, and at the time in 2016, 54%, the majority of students surveyed, said they would be less likely to study in the United States should Mr. Trump win. And of course, in 2016, this is still 3.5 years or so before the pandemic, and though there were some significant issues there. So this is 8 years later now. Group, not the same group, obviously, but students are surveyed again, asking would they be more or less likely to study in the U.S. if Mr. Trump won a second term. And back in 2016, 54% said they would be less likely. The number this year, in the same Know Your Neighborhood survey that INTED has just released the results of, that number dropped considerably to 28% would be less likely to study of international students surveyed. What's more, 42% this year said it won't make a difference who wins. 42% said it wouldn't make a difference who wins. It's just not as important to the cohort coming up this year as to who wins, who doesn't, and whether that affects where they come, whether they apply to the United States or not. So this is something that I think would be really worthwhile taking into consideration these data points. Again, it's one survey. It's the only survey I know that actually surveys specifically on presidential election perspectives on whether it matters or not. But one other point from the survey, and we'll kind of move on to a little bit broader discussion on this, is at the time back in 2016, the same survey where 14% said international student respondents said they would be more likely to study in the U.S. should Donald Trump win the election. That's in 2016 when he was running against Hillary Clinton. This time, 30% would be more likely to study in the United States if he won. So we have some real significant data points here in terms of percentage shifts, not what will happen, but percentage shifts from prospective students on the impact of the elections. That really there's more international students, would be twice as many international students this go around would be more likely to study in the U.S. if Donald Trump won. 30% versus 14% last time and 8 years ago. And only 28% said that they would be, my mistake. In 2016, 54% said they'd be less likely to study in the U.S. should Trump win. That in 2024, it's only 28%. So, and 42%, the biggest cohort, is that 42% say it won't matter at all whether he wins or not. So you got 42% saying won't matter, make a difference, who wins. You've got 30% that say they'd be more likely to study in the U.S. if Trump wins, and only 28% would be less likely. So basically, 72% of students surveyed would be either Trump win would make them more willing, or wouldn't matter whether he won or not in terms of determining where they want to study. And I think this does go back to, again, these survey results are certainly before any of the recent topics we just covered in the first question about Trump's statement about green cards for all foreign college graduates in the U.S. So it'd be really interesting to get another version of this in another couple months to see if that gains traction with them in terms of affecting their willingness to study in the United States. But certainly, it's not going to hurt. And certainly, some markets around the world, based on this pronouncement by Trump, that green cards for all international college graduates in the United States, that certainly will not hurt those numbers of students who would probably be more likely to study in the U.S. should he win. Obviously, they don't vote, but economically, the impact of more international students in the United States is huge. And that's something that we all talk about in the United States with senior leadership at our institutions, particularly at institutions that are driven primarily by dollars from these international students as they come into our country. But we all know why we do what we do internally and in our hearts on our campuses are for the larger benefit of all of our students, increasing the global competencies of our students on campus, awareness of the issues that are involved in this world that they're going to have to confront when they graduate and go into the work world. And certainly that's that cultural immersion that international students have in the United States certainly paints that broader and better picture of the United States as a destination, dispels those negative perceptions they might have had, maybe reinforces some, dispels others, positively and negatively. So all of these things are ones that we really want to understand and appreciate and frankly talk about when we can. We can't really talk about prospective policies that candidates want to implement. That's never part of what we should focus on, because none of it matters until actual congressional legislation gets implemented or executive actions get taken that change things. Then you can use that as hopefully a positive way of talking about the U.S. as a destination. That's that perspective piece we always talk about here, related to the 6 Ps of strategic international education, international enrollment management. That first P, perspective, that global perspective on these are things that matter in many markets around the world, is how we're viewed and how we compare to our competitor nations in the Big Four, Canada, UK, Australia. Those other 3 are certainly taking a lot of hits lately and are seeing visa numbers drop. We're seeing visa numbers go up year on year. They're not. So it's our competitive advantage now. And depending on what happens with the election, though, yes, I agree, it won't matter as much in the election for international students based on what we're seeing from students, prospective student interest that are in the pipeline now, as to whether they'll come up, other than maybe making it more. There's no corresponding numbers for whether Biden's reelected, whether that matters in this survey. That would have been interesting to see as well. But the lion's share, 40, or the simple, slightly less than the majority, the plurality of prospective students in the survey said no, it won't matter who's in the White House, because they'll still want to apply because it's America, and because what has the values of America, and the stories that we talk about, one in particular that I'll share in the chat. USA stands out amid a crackdown on international student visas across the world. And again, talking about what we've been talking about for 3-4 weeks, so months even, about how Canada, UK, Australia have all restricted visas for international students over the last few months. And we'll really start seeing the consequences of that this spring and fall. And we are standing out right now. Again, pending any complete about faces in terms of visa policy when after the elections are complete and new or current president gets inaugurated for a second term. Right now, we're sitting pretty, and hopefully that influences interest for the fall in a positive way. Because of what's happening in the other countries, and that's always something we need to keep in mind, is how we sit compared to our competitors. Not just our competitors within the United States, within even our own state, it's our competitors globally for the same students. Because most students nowadays are applying in the key markets, are applying to multiple countries for their potential destinations for higher education. So let's get to our final question of the day, and that is, how are Australian and New Zealander visa restrictions for international students playing out? Now, what we've seen post-COVID, as these countries have come out of the recession, or not the recession created by COVID, you now see students from certain countries or applying to certain countries getting turned off either by limits that have been imposed by the government in Canada, Australia, and UK, prohibiting dependent visas for non-PhD students and other tightening of regulations, particularly on minimum salary requirements for new hires, increasing those and pricing out international students out of some key job areas. That you see students kind of voting with their feet in terms of where they're going. You see for students in China that have been looking at Australia, their recent actions in the Australian government with the focus on net reduction of almost 50% in net migration to Australia, the impact that will have on universities, in fact on vocational education primarily, but also at universities in terms of who gets visas. Students in China, there's an article from Times Higher Ed this past week that says the proposed visa caps, soaring rejection rates, and anti-China perceptions are scaring off countries. Australia's most valuable student cohort, those students from China. So there's also a story from New Zealand that visa rejection rates of Indian students who are looking to study in New Zealand are now nearly 40% of Indians applying for student visas to New Zealand are being rejected, even to the universities. So there's some real restrictions happening here, real cutbacks in the number of visas being awarded. Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, that are impacting what we do in the United States in a primarily positive way, because as it becomes more restrictive in other countries, we still have our own challenges. We're certainly not perfect by any stretch. We always say that. But when we look at our issues that are primarily around the visa rejection rates globally are higher than they should be. It used to be 86% back in the early teens. Now it's down to 63%, 60% worldwide. So there's been some real drops because there's been increases in numbers of applicants recently, post-COVID. And in certain markets, particularly in Africa, we've seen significant jumps in the visa denial rates. That's a broader issue that certainly advocacy groups like the U.S. for Success Coalition are encouraging senators, congressmen to study this issue and to see if there's anything that can be done to change the dynamic there in terms of how we are making decisions in consulates about who gets visas from these key markets. So we're seeing a lot of lots of interesting developments here on this front, and that trying to adjust how we do what we do in the U.S. to be more competitive globally. And certainly when we do that, we examine some of the core issues that are preventing us from enrolling more international students, loosening the spigot, so to speak, to allow more in. I think we're positioning ourselves for a tremendous growth to potentially double to 2 million students in the next 10 years, as Alan Goodman from IIE pointed out in their recent survey data. So a lot of positives coming from the United States, cautiously optimistic that no matter what happens with the election, that something, particularly with this new information from President Trump, is it going to be a game changer? Is it going to happen? If it did happen, it would be a game changer. Will it happen? A lot of ifs, ands, and buts that need to be answered before that ever happens. First, he has to win the election, but a lot of things need to happen to make any significant changes there. But all good from this week on the midweek roundup. We hope that you are having a productive start to your summer, and we look forward to chatting with you again in the coming week. So until next time, we wish you the very best. Cheers.